Hey, what's going on, CNF buddies? You know how I'm always getting on your case for honestly writing or rating the show? Check out what I did in 60 seconds for Writing Class Radio, hosted by Andrea Askowitz and Allison Langer. Here's my review done on an iPhone 5C. Lime green is the C. Titled, Go On, Be a Dick. Quote, WCR is where a beginner and a pro can learn the finer things of craft, e.g., being a likable narrator by becoming the most unsavory person in the story. Do yourself a solid and subscribe, end quote. If you don't subscribe to Writing Class Radio, I might question your intelligence. So, riff. Hey, I like shout-outs. Okay, let's rock and roll. This is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak with the world's best artists about creating works of nonfiction. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Hey. Leaders in the world of narrative journalism, memoir, essay, doc film, and radio, and I try to share their origins, stories behind the stories, habits, and routines, so you can apply their tools of mastery to your own work. Let's talk to Hope Wabuke this week for episode 87. She's at Hope Wabuke on Twitter and at hopewabuke.com. That's HOPEWABUKE. Hope is a poet, though she knows it, and her essay, The Animal in the Yard, is one of 6 Pushcart nominations for Creative Nonfiction Magazine. No, we're not a couple, but our friends tell us we like each other. I had a real hard time cutting this interview down, something I do to all of them, but because she is so wise and illuminating throughout, I left this largely untouched. She talks about the global African diaspora, that's poet language, starting from the present as a place to explore the past, non-linear narratives, how her parents escaped genocide in Uganda to start a new life in America, empowering the marginalized, and what it means to be a watcher. So much goodness, it's time I get the hell out of the way and introduce you to the great Hope Wabuke.
Scotland. A lot of research for my new poetry collection about exploring Blackness in space and time across history. So looking at figures of Blackness that people don't expect, like, trumpeters in 15th century Scotland and, or in 8th century Ireland. And people don't realize that Black people are everywhere at all times. So it's pretty exciting to dig through the research
Oh, that's
and
fascinating, and that's for a poetry collection or something or something else.
Yeah, my poetry collection that I just finished, that I just started sending out, is very tied with the essay. I guess it's about my family's escape from Idi Amin's genocide in 1976 and the healing and recovery in America. And so that was very personal, and looking at, a very specific story of Blackness and, the 1970s post-colonial Africa and the kind of genocides and instability that was the legacy of the European colonialism, and looking at, then the refugee experience in America. And then it made me want to, so for my new book, it made me want to broaden that question and look at, because that was looking at Blackness across space, if you will, these two spaces, but looking at Blackness across multiple spaces and multiple times. So looking for representations in history and literature and people and looking at cultural events. I have a poem, about Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species and how that relates to Blackness and the Venus Hottentot, and just various conversations, whether in America, South America, Asia, Africa, Europe. So it's really interesting. It's very sad because you see over and over this common narrative of violence against Blackness, but you also see the tremendous resilience and ability to build and thrive and survive in these terrifying, horrific conditions. It's exciting. It's also the first poetry collection I've done research for.
Yeah.
So it's exciting to dig into archives and so forth. And
It's really cool. Like as someone who's somewhat of a novice of reading and consuming poetry, it'll be. I wanted to kind of talk to you about that anyway, but especially what you're doing with this latest project of like reported poetry, and I think that's really fascinating. So we can definitely dig into that a bit. But in your current research and into your ancestry and the Black experience across space and time, like what has been the most illuminating for you to discover throughout your research?
I think what has been most illuminating is to be able to subvert preconceptions. I don't have preconceptions of Blackness because I go into it having had my formative life experience and my research interests, which led me to question and think about these questions and ideas. But as I engage through my life, whether with students or fellow academics or people in any walk of life, they have a very certain stereotypical understanding of Blackness. And for a long time in America, it was simply that single story, as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says, of Blackness as Black people were brought here in 1619 as slaves, then the 1865 Civil War, 1960, then Jim Crow, the 1960s Civil Rights, Martin Luther King, Obama, racism is over, the end.
Hmm.
And that there is a much larger narrative of Blackness growing up in America, first in the Midwest and then in Los Angeles as a young girl. That was the only narrative I found. And when we studied Blackness for a very short time, probably, 2 days in February and one day on Martin Luther King Day at that point in time,
Hmm.
maybe a couple of pages in the history books. That was the narrative. And I was looking for myself. Where is my experience? I'm living in America, but I am immediately from Africa. My family's from Uganda, and we've lived through this genocide, and we've lived through colonialism, and we've lived through having our own independent sovereign nations before that with this rich cultural history. And you didn't find any of that anywhere. And so, in a way, one can say that my very early interest in writing was simply sparked by absence and wanting to find my story. And when I could not find it, trying to discover it and write it, and then later on in life continuing to look for that. And as I got older, I was able to find those spaces in books for myself. I was able to fill in the gaps. The day in fifth grade that I found Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin, I remember, and it changed my life. And then that led to my Angelou and Toni Morrison, and so there was still that kind of narrative. But then I remember I think it was in 1998, maybe my senior year of high school, that Zadie Smith's White Teeth came out. And that was revolutionary for me because here was the narrative of Blackness that was outside that that stereotypical American narrative. Here was a woman talking about being directly from an African country. She was in Britain, so she was writing from that experience of being a British subject, but she was looking at the immigrant experience. She wasn't just looking at Blackness. She also had, Indian characters in that novel who had come from the kind of colonial experience of the Indian state. And I did not know how to articulate it. It was my first formative experience of reckoning with the global African diaspora and having somebody articulate that in a written form, in a literary work, in a work that wasn't just so vibrant in those subjects, but so vibrant in the telling. Zadie Smith is such a wonderful literary talent with her prose and the way it leapt off the page. And plus, it was the coming of age story of a young girl. How lucky could I get? So, so Zadie Smith really, she was a light. And then I was able to seek out other writers of that ilk, Helen Oyeyemi, um, Warsan Shire later, and all the wonderful, my contemporary African and Afro European and African women poets, and then that led to studying Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka and Miriam Abad, Lucia Nasheta, and all these voices that not one I had experienced in 12 years of education. Uh, which is very sad. But that's also, I suppose, why I still have one foot in academia as a professor because of that. Toni Morrison says, write the book that if nobody has written the book you want to read, you have to write that book, to paraphrase her very loosely. But I think of it as, if nobody is teaching that subject or writing or providing that space, you have to teach that subject. And so for that little girl who for 12 years of education in public schools was not given any narrative of the global African diaspora or Africanness. And I couldn't not find any of those classes in college as an undergraduate either. I remember that's why I still, teach in the academia. Right now I'm teaching African lit and, poetry and various writing classes, but I make a very concerted effort to ground my class in diversity of form, of background, of representation on every level, whether it be race, class, gender, sexual orientation, regionality, because it's important to have own voices and to have representation and to have that dialogue. So to get back to the very beginning of your question, what did I find surprising? Those preconceptions of blackness, because that story is not told, people are not taught it, they don't know it, and if you don't seek it out like I did, you don't have any understanding that different narratives of blackness exist. When I tell my students that of the over 10 million slaves brought from the African continent to the Americas, 11 million of them went to Central and South America, and only a couple 100,000 came to America, they're stunned. Now it's very compelling to have South American and Central American authors like Junot Diaz or Vanessa Martyr reckoning with their blackness, their legacy of blackness, and owning that in a way that Central and South America have not, because there's a very, again, there's that climate of anti-blackness that is on a global scale. If you look at the severe colorism in Brazil, for example, it's a case in point with the violence towards darker skinned peoples, or the formation of Haiti and Dominican Republic is that same conversation of not wanting darker skinned people there and wanting the kind of lighter skinned Spanish speaking people. So that kind of white supremacist racial structure hierarchy you see all over the world internalized. And colonialism was a big part of propagating that. And we still have that mentality today. For example, like I come back to Ngugi wa Thiong'o's text, Decolonizing the Mind, and how do you get past how do you unimprison a mind that's been taught to believe that everything about it is wrong and that only a kind of white Western supremacist structure is right, if you will. How do you deconstruct that, interrogate that, empower, and move past that kind of brainwashing and Stockholm syndrome?
Mm.
And so that's part of why this interrogation that I'm doing is to allow those voices to come to light. I remember being very excited by movies like Belle, which shine a light on these narratives that have been hidden, or projects like The Black Victorians, which look at a compendium of photographs of Blacks in the Victorian era, and why that's necessary to reclaim people who have been lost in the shadows. And I see this work being done not just in ethnic studies of Blackness, like I am doing, but in gender, for example, as we look and reclaim the work done by women that's been silenced in various social justice movements, like the Black rights movements from 1920 to 1960. There's a really lovely book coming out that unearths the work of women in that movement that have been silenced. And so it's very compelling. It's very interesting. And I'm excited that I'm able to do this work, that it's in line with my creative preoccupations of research, and that hopefully it will do something good and in the world.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about it. Like I'm sort of just loving hearing everything you're saying, and it's very illuminating for me to hear all these different paths you can go down to educate yourself and maybe buck some preconceived notions about what we know about XYZ narratives throughout in the Western Hemisphere and even into the Eastern Hemisphere. Where might you? I mean, you rattled off a litany of wonderful writers, and I wonder What might be a good starting point for people who want to educate themselves more on this, the experiences you're talking about?
I think there's two ways to go about it. You can start with in the beginning, if you will, whatever you determine the beginning chronologically, and start from the past, or you can start from the present. And I like to start from where we are now. I was very fortunate to come across Dr. Michelle Wright's work on Blackness and epiphenomenal time, and talking about how the linear narrative is still a kind of convention that privileges Western and whiteness, because it starts with colonialism. It starts with the arrival of whites into Africa, and that's where the narrative starts. For example, a lot of African literature, the way it is taught, and where you start the narrative matters. If you start the narrative using whiteness to validate blackness, it's you're telling the same story, you're telling the same broken narrative. If you start before that, if you start with the African oral traditions, you're starting a different place with a different consciousness of Africa as an empowered, independent, individual continent of sovereign nations, and dealing with them in that way. Or you can start in the present with, which is where I like to start, because it's vibrant and visceral, and it's has those questions that are lingering throughout time, but we can access them and attach them. And I like to start in the present because it's the most access that any marginalized group has had in the Western world to articulate their stories, and in a way that their stories are not um, taken from them and made into something they're not. So if you start looking at all the work that's being done now with, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, of course, is a lovely voice, both for her nonfiction, We Should All Be Feminists, The Danger of a Single Story, and her fiction. I teach Americana in my women's lit classes and African lit classes for that reason. It talks about this global question of Blackness as we see Black people in Nigeria, we see Black people in America, we see Black people in France, we see Black people in England, and as they have a conversation, a very uncomfortable conversation about these many spaces of the diaspora, and what that means, and what we mean to each other. And I think it's important to reckon with that multiplicity, also talking about gender and class, if you will. And Helen Oyeyemi is a great author to start with that way. Chinelo Paranta, who I love because, she is a young Nigerian American author, but she's also, I guess the face of queer African writers, because she's an out lesbian, and it's still a punishable crime by death to be homosexual in Nigeria, and so her voice would have been a voice that would have been silenced, 50, 100 years ago, just because of that triple marginalization. So I really like to start in the present because you have space for all these voices, and you can have these conversations and then take these questions of language, identity, home, representation, marginalization, colonialism, white supremacy, global blackness, the diaspora, what is refugee, what is immigration, what does it mean to be in this liminal space of duality where you are more than one thing, and travel with those throughout time and see how those questions worked, in the 1960s with the formation of post-colonial African literature, with Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Soyinka, and you can travel, beyond that and look at the African oral traditions and fables and parables that were told for hundreds and hundreds of years through the griots, and how that cultural tradition both told the stories, the fictional stories, the history and genealogy, and also told the cultural parables and the values, and kept the language alive, and how that's so present, if you will. And I like to do it that way. And I think that the concept of epiphenomenal time, where time is circular and you simply pick the most relevant and important moment to start and then travel on the timeline backwards and forwards is a way to empower Blackness and empower other marginalized voices, again, that have been silenced and would not have had any representation before now.
Hmm. What are some common questions that you find that your students who are maybe looking to knock down some of these walls in their own mind and those preconceptions you talk about? What are some of those common questions that you find your students asking you, and then how do you sort of, push them in the right directions and educate them thoroughly?
Very interesting because my African literature class just finished watching Half of a Yellow Sun yesterday, and we were having our group discussion. And I had asked them, what are some of the questions you have? What are some of your main ideas? And what are some moments of fascination that you have? And over, many of them said, that we didn't know this happened. They didn't know anything about Nigerian history, that they didn't know that they didn't know about the Nigerian Biafran War in 1967 to 1970, that they didn't know about the coup before that and the coup before that, that they didn't know about what colonialism was, that they didn't know that colonialism was linked to slavery and why that was very purposeful and specific. And it wasn't just the taking of resources of land and diamonds and oil and coltan and and ivory, but it was the imprisonment of the mind, because to take somebody's country and resources, you have to make them believe that they're less than you, and that that there are documents by British parliaments in the 19th century saying, we traveled through Africa and it's a wonderful, vibrant, peaceful place. What can we do to break down this continent so that we can take it over? And it was a very specific, laid out plan of domination and control and destruction. And that therefore the severe and complete and sudden withdrawal in the 1950s and 1960s, after granting all these manufactured African states independence, was also deliberate, because they could have stayed, these European colonial powers, and made sure that the transition of power would have been more stable and safe. But instead, after coming in and putting these sovereign nations into artificial boundaries where you have tribes that are not anywhere, have nothing in common, are then put into these nations and then ruling them for a century or so, and completely disempowering the native peoples and putting them into a state of serfdom and imprisoning their minds and to believe that they're less than, then completely withdrawing and saying, see ya, you take it over for yourselves. And so, of course, there would be instability. Of course, there would be warring factions. Of course, there would be this violence as these leaders who have been trained with the British military then do what they were told. They're not functioning by their traditional African values of communality and respect. They're functioning by these alien Western values of domination and violence they've been taught, if you will. And so it's a complete change, and it's very purposeful. And the link between colonialism and slavery, the reason why colonialism, heightened in the 19th century because of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, of needing them to spread outward for resources and land, and then why it then began to fade out post World Wars as Europe hunkered down to rebuild, and how that 1960s independence movement was tied into the 60s movements in the West. And so making these global conversations, as well as deconstructing the very specific destructive agenda of colonialism, the relationship of colonialism and slavery. Because again, most African countries and communities are very communal based. And so when you had the theft of people starting as early as the 8th century AD, but really beginning in 1441 AD, and then as we know, reaching its heyday in the 17th century. We have this long history of people disappearing, both through slavery and then through the post-colonial struggle of the emerging nation state in that way. And of course, there is the fundamental preconception that everyone has that Africa is a country. And so breaking down that immediate preconception that Africa is not a country, it is a continent full of diverse countries, but those countries were created as we know them now as artificial boundaries by the European colonizing powers. And we have to remember that Africa before this looked completely different with its sovereign nation states composed of different tribes and ethnic groups.
What was it early on in your life where you decide when you were starting to have these questions that you turned towards the arts, towards poetry, towards writing as a way of making sense of it versus maybe taking some other sort of tenure track? But yeah, there are different paths to explore your curiosity. And you went down. You're a poet and a writer and a beautiful one at that, beautiful writer. And I wanted to know, like, what was that moment like when you decided to take your talents down that road?
My parents always say I was reading before I could walk.
Hmm.
I was always reading, um, thinking and sitting in my head. There were five kids in my family, and I was the third, the middle one. And so my two sisters, my older sisters, are very loud and very, very social people. And maybe it's that middle child that then you're watching and listening and thinking and we grew up in a house of silence, I should say, because, and I write about this in The Animal in the Yard, the essay in creative nonfiction, uh, because my parents had escaped from Idi Amin's genocide in 1976. My dad was a professor, a Christian, a minister. Uh, my mother was a nurse, and so they were who Idi, and a Christian. They were who Idi Amin would target. They were at first he got rid of the British, and everybody was saying, "Yay, that's good. Ugandans for Uganda. That's wonderful." But then he got rid of, anybody who was not Ugandan, the Jews, the Indians, the other Asian groups, and that was a lot of the middle class trade structure. So the economy began to be a little bit unstable, and so of course, then what do all demagogues and dictators do? They must look for a scapegoat. So then it was anybody who is Ugandan who has Western values. So anybody who was Christian or educated in a Western university or teaching at the Makerere University, which is where my dad was teaching in the capital city of Kampala, and so Amin installed his son at the university next door to my parents to kind of keep so he could have a presence to spy on the university to see that they were not teaching anything that he would disapprove of. And he would periodically, storm university and attack it at various times. And I remember one massacre, my parents were supposed to be there and they were not there. And my dad says, God saved them. And then people in my family began to disappear. My dad somehow got word that they were next on the list. So they just left in the night. They left everything. I have written, poems about this also in the Bani family. And they disappeared and went over the border to Kenya next door, where they were lucky to get a visa to England and then, just a temporary one. And then somehow my dad was lucky to get a visa to the United States, a student visa, because how long it takes to get accepted to university. Somehow he got accepted to the University of Minnesota in a matter of weeks, and they offered him this scholarship, and his visa went through, and so they went to Minnesota. And again, he says it was an act of God. And then they did their degrees. My dad got his PhD and settled into working in virology and the sciences, and then we moved to California. But but in America, my parents were not prepared for the racism they would experience in America against Black people. I remember them in Minnesota, the neighbors throwing rocks through our windows, saying that we don't want those niggers here. When I was
Jeez.
about 2 or 3 years old, and the police all was just parked on the corner watching our house, following my dad as he drove through the town to school and back. The minister of the church we went to coming to our house, not wanting to sit down, not wanting to touch anything, just saying, don't come back to our church. We don't want you here. And so those were the things my parents experienced as their introduction to the United States. But at the same time, they were just so happy to be alive. And so, but they did not know how to handle American racism. They didn't know how to navigate that because we were not part of that lineage. We did not have that history. And so growing up in America, again, as I said before, there was no narrative at that time of anything else in terms of Blackness. So you're going throughout the world, you're Black, the region was Black in America, and you're read as that thing. If you're not read as, oh, you're an African immigrant, or you're again a refugee with a different Blackness, there's just that single story. And so I think growing up in America with that duality made me, as I said earlier, look for representations of the global African diaspora, and not finding it was fueled my continual search. And, I want to make clear here that I'm not negating that Black American experience. I think it is part of the global African diaspora and a very important narrative, but it's not the only one, is what I'm trying to say with that. So my parents did not talk about any of this. So these are all things that I have learned by hook and by crook of pulling teeth over 36 years, and mostly from talking to my aunts, or my sisters also pulling teeth with my parents, and then we pull our stories of, hey, I discovered this, or hey, I discovered this. Because what I realize now that I didn't realize then is my parents had post-traumatic stress disorder, living through colonialism, the rape of your culture, and imprisonment of your mind, and then living through a genocide of a dictator who's trying to kill you. Living through that fear from 1971 to 1976, 5 years of never knowing if you're going to be killed, of massacres, of military presence everywhere, of armed forces, of coups, of violence. It's terrifying. So they did not talk about it. I would always ask questions because I was looking, because I wanted to know. And they would always just say, we can't talk about it. No, no, no. And so that, I suppose, fueled my curiosity, because if I was searching, I would search for it everywhere, and wanting, and then writing, trying to write that narrative, to understand it, to articulate it, to remember it. I think that's why, rather than writing a full-length prose memoir, I ended up writing that story in a collection of poems, The Body Family, because it was, these fragments that I overheard or discovered or unearthed, rather than a sustained, continuous narrative. And so the most sustained prose narrative that I have written about it is The Animal in the Yard, which he published in Creative Nonfiction, which intercuts that story, touches on it, but it's mostly about the present, set in the present, with my father falling sick from a chronic illness and beginning the process of dying. And how do you deal with a parent dying? And as you look back at this life, this tremendous life that he had, and I'm in awe of my parents, their strength and what they did to survive and to get us here. Every day as I get older and as I'm a parent now, I just think about them in awe.
Yeah, you touched upon something I just wanted to ask you, like, given the experience that they had, like having like you were talking about all these different narratives, they had one that they were able to escape, and then parachute into a completely different one, and then have to deal with an entirely different experience that they've landed in the middle of. And you can totally understand their unwillingness to want to talk about any of it, because it was so traumatic. And you were just talking about how you admire their strength, and I wonder, like, how do you draw inspiration from them, from their experience, and sort of apply that and overlay it to your own life as you're going forward and educating people, readerships and students?
Oh my goodness. I think this is something that all children of immigrants can reckon with, especially children of refugees, where it's like your parents moved the entire world. What are you going to do with your one wild life? As Mary Oliver says, if your parents, did so much, and wondering, I'm older than they were now, and thinking that my dad was in his early 20s. He was the head of the family. He had my older sister was born already, and my mom, he had two dependents, and it was on him to. And how do you raising a child is hard enough, being married and making a relationship work viably, respectfully, honoring both people's humanity is hard enough. And doing both of those things while under fear for your life and your children's life. Now my son is 5 now, and just that immediate moment when he's born, and you just realize you will do anything, anything to make sure this child gets and has what they need. And on that basic level, it was doing anything to make sure that his child, his children would stay alive, and you find the strength to do it. And so I look at them, and I'm inspired whenever I feel like things are difficult or perhaps impossible, when I experience microaggressions or macroaggressions of racism or gender or both. I think my parents, you know, they did so much with so little. And when what they were dealing with, not just genocide and escape and starting a brand new life in a brand new country, but they dealt with racism on an entirely different level than I do. And I think it's pretty bad what I deal with. And so when I think about whenever I feel overwhelmed by, a racist interaction I had with somebody or a sexist interaction I had, I remember the strength of our forebears, both in this country and that tremendously awful history, and my parents' story. And I think, I can do this. I have to do this. They inspire me to do what I think I cannot do, to be the best version of myself. And at the same time, though, you hear, I have a poem, Judges, where I talk about my father and his, when he went to school, he had to wake up at 5 a.m. and work in the farm and then walk 2 miles to school and then, work at school all day and do their homework, and that they had to write with sticks in the dirt and then walk back and fetch the water and farm and hunt the animals for food, because my dad grew up on a farm in Uganda, and that was his life, and working so hard because there's only one chance, only really the missionaries would only sponsor one student to go to and pay his school fees to go to high school, and then he would sell chapati on the road to earn money for his school fees and to pay for college. So at the same time, though, they think we did that, so you can do it too, you know. And so there's expectation of greatness and success because you're in America, the land of opportunity, and they did so much with so little. And I think that however, with children of immigrants and their parents, there's this disconnect of it's a completely different culture, and what it took to succeed in Uganda and those lessons he learned to succeed. Some of them are applicable, but there are certain lessons that I didn't learn about how to succeed in America because they didn't know them. And it's those lessons that one needs to succeed, those American cultural capital lessons of, for example, knowing to talk to the dean of your department so that they can see you and get face value with you so that if they have awards, they'll nominate you for them, knowing that you need to do an unpaid internship to then apply for a job at the company. But of course, one cannot do the unpaid internship because one needs to work. But, knowing to talk to your professors, knowing what office hours are, knowing the importance of a credit score that's more important perhaps than straight A's in America.
Mm-hmm.
And, which is what, so these things of cultural capital that are very specific to American society, those were the things that they couldn't teach us, that we bumbled around learning on our own through friends and mistakes. I was lucky in that I went to an elite primary white institution, Northwestern, and then NYU. So I was, and because I'm a watcher, as a writer, you're a watcher. And so I was able to watch my peers and model my behavior from them. That's how I learned a lot of these cultural capital things, from being in the space with privileged white people who had this cultural capital, who had generations of going through this process, going to college, succeeding, and so forth. But at the same time, it was very difficult because I was the only Black student in my major at my university in 1998. And I was one of two in my grad program. So again, and then you're this heightened visibility and invisibility, and you have these stereotypes pushed on you and so forth, and you deal with a lot of racism and the intersection of racism and sexism as a woman. I wrote an essay about that for Salon a while ago, talking about the experience of being a Black woman at a primarily white elite institution. So, but the corollary to that is I got the education I needed to get to do what I need to do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here doing what I am. So it's a trade-off, really. I think the thing is as I look at how to prepare my son for that, is that to provide a safe space for him as he goes through that process, because now I know what it's going to be like because I've been through that. And so I know how to help him navigate through American culture in a way that my parents could not help me. But they gave me life, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Did you at any point feel a lot of pressure to live up to the expectations of your parents?
Well, always. And this is something that, again, I talk with my friends who are children of immigrants a lot. Where we ended up growing up, when I was 8, we moved from Minnesota, which was a primarily white town. As you know, we moved to Arcadia, California. And when we moved there in, I want to say the early 90s, it was about 90% white. And about 2 years later, it had become 90% Asian. We were growing up in a community of other people of color, which was nice. But what I don't think my parents realized was that they may have been people of color, but just as they say, all skin folk ain't kinfolk, and a lot of people of color internalize that white supremacist structure of anti-blackness, of believing that whiteness is the best, and then your value lays in how white you are correspondingly. So this hierarchy of whiteness, and then Asian Americans as the lightest and most the quote unquote model minority, and then you have Latinos, and then you have blackness, and that the one commonality again is this global anti-blackness, because this kind of white supremacist mentality is global now, and so it people a lot of people yet don't necessarily understand that. You understand that if you're a person of color, but a lot of times it's white versus POC, and what the animal in the lard begins to reckon with a little bit is that people of color can and are racist to other people of color because of internalizing that white supremacist structure and aspiring to whiteness as the ideal, and doing whatever you can to throw each other under the bus to be adopted. And you see that today as various political parties try to splinter that power pack of people of color that elected President Obama, and say, hey, wait a minute, you Asian Americans, like you're actually kind of white. You come over here and be Republican, and you vote against affirmative action that helps Black people is hurting you, and hey, you Latinas, you're actually pretty religious and conservative. Come over here and hate on other people of color, and play into our idea of white supremacy. And so you see it very clearly. You see how people are trying to use it. And as I have always said and realized from the moment I was a very young girl, because I was growing up in all this and reckoning with all these questions. And the thing that was very clear was I had nobody to help me navigate this, to explain this to me, or to make sense of it, or to provide safety for me, because my parents didn't know and couldn't get it and were terrified and silent. My sisters were in the same boat as me, and we were just trying to figure it all out. We knew no other Africans really, except when we went, on these long drives to visit my parents' friends in Canada or various other parts of the country where there'd be pockets of other African refugees that they somehow knew. But for the most part, we were in this milieu of absence of representation, silence, and this climate of global anti-blackness that was very much tied into this single story of American blackness. And so all these things were working together and really inspired me to seek and write and make sense of this. So I think I wrote my first story when I was 5, was very bad. But my mom unearthed it and showed it to me the other day, and I was just like, oh dear, why do you have this? But it was, so it was trying that, and that was what made me want to be a writer, because I was a young girl, and of course added on to that the gender thing, because growing up in Southern California, there's Hollywood and there's this idealization of white, blonde, size zero beauty, and there's this very severe culture um, of the male gaze and male entitlement to female bodies, um, if you will. Their violence towards that, being catcalled and followed as a girl who was 12. Very early on, I knew I wanted to become a writer to speak about all these things and to work for social change and to give voices to people of color, to immigrants, to refugees, to women, to Black people. And that was what fueled me and fueled my writing and my academic drive all the way to college. I remember being so excited. Okay, I'm going to major in English and I'm going to, write, and being really excited in my first class and being told by my white professors for the next 4 years, you can't write this. Nobody wants to read Black stories. These won't sell. Nobody wants nigger stories, just all that stuff.
What?
And for the next 4 years. And eventually I began to believe it. And so by the time I got to grad school at NYU, I believed it, but my thesis had nothing to do with Blackness. My creative thesis was a retelling of the Greek Persephone myth, because I had been silenced, and I had again gotten imprisoned in that colonial mentality of, you cannot engage with Blackness and be successful. And as I my voice was lost. And for the next few years, as I tried to write and publish, nothing happened with my career. And it wasn't until I came back to LA from New York and began to, talk to my parents and work on the body family and write down these stories and imagine these stories about my family, and that's when my career as a writer took off. And it was very clear that I needed to be in my own voice. And I think one of the revelatory moments was going to VONA, the Women Voices workshop that Uno Diaz and DM Jones founded ages ago. And it's only for people of color. And it was so empowering. For the first time in our creative writing workshop, I did not have to explain myself. For the first time, I wasn't the only Black person or or one of two Black people. And it was just a completely safe space where I found my voice again. I've written about that too.
Mm-hmm.
The need for diverse MFA programs, the need for diversity that is safe for the people of color. Because right now diversity is looked at as, oh, let's import some diversity to provide an eye-opening experience for our 95% white population at this institution. And it's safe for them, but not safe for the people of color. And so looking at how can it be safe for us is to have more of us. I never had a Black teacher until grad school. I had one Black professor in my entire life, and I've probably been in school for about 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I did 20 years of education. And so that's why I keep one foot in academia, because I know that just my being there means a lot to those students. And I have so many students. My students of color just flock to my office hours and send me emails just going, thank you for being here. Thank you for your perspective, which allows questions to arise and leads discussions and raises viewpoints and the text that you choose. And so, it's very important. And looking at that, I really think it's important to look at how do you make diversity safe for the diverse people is something that institutions really need to think about, if you will. And so I want to get back to something else you asked me when you asked me why did I become a writer. And I worked at the Arcadia Public Library for 4 years in shelving books. And after 4 years of that, I realized something. I realized that you spend the majority of your life doing your job. And I was the kind of person I wanted to have a job that I enjoyed and that fulfilled me. And that wasn't something that was a complete disconnect to my life or that was draining my life or that I felt was something that was not in line with my values and passions, because I would write no matter what. I could, and now I see that I can best serve, the interests of advocating for women's rights and gender equality and ending rape culture and rights for people of color and rights for all people through my writing. It can reach a lot more people than other work I could do. I think everybody has their own race to run and has their own um, specific talents that they're given. And I am a writer. I'm an antisocial recluse. I am not a lawyer in that way, somebody who wants to get out and be a politician and lead in that. That's my older sister, you know. I am the one who's very happy to sit in my room for 8 hours with my computer and send it out in the world and have a conversation with people that way and to feel like when 20,000 people have shared an article I've written that hopefully, and they're commenting about how this is what their entire life story, or this is something that resonates with them or makes them think or opens them up to an idea that they hadn't thought about that makes them a little bit closer to a world of social justice and equality for all. That's my contribution.
And what was that like when you were finally allowed to embrace your own voice as a writer? When you were at that conference or that collective of people of color, and you were finally allowed to just be yourself. Did you find that when you were writing at that point and from that space that you just couldn't stop? Like it was like a flood.
Yeah, writing has always been a flood to me. No matter what I'm writing,
Mm.
I can get involved. And I think when I was in New York, I wrote a novel and two short story collections, and some which will never see the light of day. Hopefully, I realized that what I really need to be writing was poetry and essays. Um, but exactly, it's a flood. I love what Pablo Picasso says about creativity, where it's about you're filling yourself up and emptying yourself. And artists are doing that constantly. And as you go through the world, you're filling yourself up and emptying yourself. And I had at that point in time, especially, just a lifetime of stories that had been silenced, and that the space gave me permission to remember why I wanted to be a writer, remember what my purpose here was, and to do it. And so I've been doing it ever since. Um, then I think on a, I don't know how politically correct this is to say, but I think in a strange way, being at Atlanta made me realize for a brief moment what it's like to be white, specifically a white man in America, because your existence was completely normalized. You were never othered.
Mm.
You from the moment you wake up to the moment you went to sleep, the world looked like you. I engaged with people who looked like me. I was taught by people who looked like me. I never saw somebody who didn't look like me. That was an experience I've never had in my entire life. And I think that's the difference between my parents and my sisters and I, is that they grew up with their existence being normalized. They grew up where everybody was black. And we grew up in spaces where we're the only black people. And I think that you cannot overemphasize the importance of having your existence simply validated on an everyday level for your entire life and normalized in that way.
In your experience with writing essay and poetry, I always love to dig into how a writer sets up a process by which they're able to get the work done. And I'd extend the same question to you. Like, how do you engineer your days so you are writing and getting words done, whether they get published or not, or whatever, but just so you're in that generative flow. So how do you set up your days so that you're creating work that may or may not see the light of day?
Well, one thing I will say is that I always have projects in various stages. I have projects I am writing, I have projects I am ideating and thinking about, I have projects I am editing, and of course, projects that are done and projects that are simply percolating on the very, very back burner, just waiting for time. Um, Before I was a mom, I would wake up around 5 or 6 a.m., do yoga for a couple hours, and that would then lead into my writing space. And I'd write for 8 hours if I didn't have to teach that day, or I'd go teach and then come back and do yoga and write and then see friends. And that was very simple. So I was writing from anywhere 4 to 8 hours a day. After I had my son, my life was simply divided into taking care of baby when he's awake and when he's asleep, just writing.
Hmm.
And I didn't sleep, I don't think, really, for the first 3.5 years of his life. I was simply, when he was awake, I was with him and we'd go on play dates with his friends and, just living life. And then when he went down to nap, I would write. And it was actually, and when he went to sleep and I would write, and it was actually, I think, a really great discipline for a writer because if I had 2 hours to finish an essay to get to my editor, I needed to get that essay done into that 2 hour nap, you know? And so I know that everybody has a different experience of motherhood. Some mothers say that motherhood makes their careers perhaps less productive. But for me, as a writer, that creative energy of motherhood was so and is so inspiring to me. And the actual logistics of you need to write as fast as you can, as best as you can, that first draft as clear as possible, because you will not have the luxury of, weeks of revisions or hours of revisions. Um, made me made my writing career really productive and still makes it really productive. Now he's in, preschool, so I have a little bit more time, you know, during the day to write, so I don't have to write in those 2 hour smashed blocks but I still find, or at night, that 5 hours rush at night before he would go to sleep at 7. I'd write from probably 7 to 1 in the morning and then go to sleep from 1 to 6 and he'd wake up at 6 and, the day would go begin all over again. That was my life for until this year when we started preschool, or last year when we started preschool. And so, but I still, still have those moments where you have to follow the inspiration. And so you wake up in the middle of the night when you write for a couple hours. I'm like, oh wow, I woke up at midnight. It's now 6 a.m. and I've been writing for 6 hours and I can't go nap now because you have a life form to take care of or I have a class to go teach. So sometimes I am a bit delirious.
Huh.
But I think the thing is you have your writing process, which is whenever inspiration comes, you have to listen and write it down. I think the thing now is having a discipline into my writing process is I can write down the notes and then come back to it a day later or 2 days later and write for 8 hours and finish the project. And I think when I was younger, it would be I would have to do it right then and there, or I felt the idea would be lost. But kind of training your inspiration to work in a different way because life is a process of change and um, our process changes as our stages in our life change. And I think it's important to recognize that life and art are not separate, that they feel each other, and that I want to be present in my life. And life is not a distraction from the art, but the life and everything about my life, my son, my students, my friends, my family, they don't distract from it and take away from my writing, but they fuel my writing and give it energy and inspiration.
Or how would you define your ambitions as an essayist and a poet? And maybe how have those changed over the years from maybe when you were in your 20s and in grad school into where you are now as a more visible writer? Like how have your ambitions evolved?
I think I'm more patient now, and it's less about other people. When I was very young, and I think when we're very young, we are have an endless sense of self confidence and self rightness, and that gets lost as you go throughout the world. And then you find it in a different way as you get older, with less arrogance and it's less about you're confident because you don't know anything, but you're confident and secure because you now know you now know things. And can you repeat your question?
Oh, oh yeah. It dealt with just how your ambitions might have changed. Like maybe early on, it was I don't know, just get I get visible to this degree, and then maybe as you receive more validation, you're like, oh, I can start reaching higher now. I can start maybe going to some higher profile things because I do have the juice to do it and the rigor and the tenacity and work ethic if I just stick to it long enough. Like you said, like patience, you're more patient now. So maybe if you're not in the New Yorker this year, you're like, you know what? I might be there in 10 years, but and I'm cool with that. So I wonder, that's just kind of like the evolution of your ambition was kind of the crux of the question.
I think when you're really young, I know when you're like 5 or 6, my parents, of course, being the African parents, or if you're going to do something, it has to be the best. You must go to the best school, do the best things. You must success, excellence was expected. It's like
Yeah.
you expected to get straight A's. If you have an A minus, why is there an A minus on your report card? So of course, it's like I want to be a writer. My dad will. Well, then you must win the Pulitzer. So I think there were these expectations created by other people,
Yeah.
and I believe in those expectations. And as I said, and then I think it's just a process of growing up where eventually you begin to listen and understand and listen to your own voice versus other people's voices and defining what success looks like for you. I think for me as a writer, just realizing that you're always a writer, no matter if you're published or not, no matter to what degree or not, no matter if you win awards or not. And yes, the awards and things, those are always fun and nice, and they stroke your ego, and the money is nice and useful. But that writing is not about the business of writing. And writing is a business that one learns like everything else and continues, but that the writing is what sustains me, what gives me joy, and I'll always do it no matter what. And to have patience with the evolution of one's career and know that trusting yourself and trusting the work that you're doing rather than looking for external markers as validation. Audre Lorde tells us that you define yourself for yourself. And I think that
Mm.
I wish everybody would just read all Audre Lorde when they were really young, because everything she says is what I want to tell my students every day, and tell what I've told myself for a long time. And I think it's just that same process of learning to listen to yourself versus other voices and defining for yourself what is important to you and what values to you. And for me, that's it's not prizes, it's or the reputation of this or that. It's the work that I'm doing. Is it good work, and am I able to get it out in the world? And I'm lucky that um, I've met editors I love and respect, who give my work homes in their pages, and people continue to ask for my work, and the readership grows because of the work. It's about the work. It's not about me. It's not something I chose. I kind of feel very lucky to have this talent, and it was a decision I made to nurture it and train it and create a discipline and rigor and use it, and for a very specific purpose. For me, I think I remember at the bottom level, I remember taking a walk with my son. He was about 4 months old. We were walking, we were living in border West Hollywood and Hancock Park at that time. And I was taking a walk, and it was right after the Trayvon Martin killer George Zimmerman had not been arrested, and the Twitter campaign had just gone full flight with the emergence of Black Lives Matter, and he'd finally been arrested, but was very clearly going to get off or just gotten off. And this white guy on the corner looked at me and my 3-month-old son. I was carrying him in a baby carrier on my tummy, and he said to us, go back to Compton, or I'm going to shoot you like they shot that Trayvon Martin. And I personally, I've never been to Compton. I'm ashamed to say I grew up in LA, but again, I'm an antisocial recluse, and I was very young when I was growing up there, and so I've never been to Compton. I should go. I would love to go. But it was the violence, the anger, the rage, the emboldenment, the fact that
Mm.
you felt safe to say these things. And I think even now more so with our cultural climate of emboldening and accepting racism and rape culture and violence, so certainly those voices have even been more emboldened, sadly. But it was at that moment, and I'd also just come from Vona, and I was writing, and had my voice, and was, fully reveling in my voice as a Black woman writer, and not shine away from that. And I thought, fundamentally, you know, I'm writing to make a world where my son will be alive, where my son will not be killed when he's 12, like Tamir Rice, because he's playing in the park, where he won't be killed when he's 7, like Anna Jones, when the police raid a building looking for somebody else because they don't value the lives of people who live there and they'll come in with guns, where he won't be Jordan Davis or Trayvon Martin or Renisha McBride, or, on a fundamental level, it's not about prizes or publications or any of that for me. It's about putting these words on paper so that people who look like me won't be killed. So that my son will grow up and be alive. And with every word I write, every poem I write, it's in service of Black lives, of women's lives, of Black women's lives, people of color lives, of these children who deserve to be treated as people and not future threats just because of the color of their skin and not being seen as a human being. So it's a different conversation for me on a fundamental level, I think, in answer to your question as to why that noise doesn't matter.
Where does your optimism lie? Because I hear in your voice, like, I just such a great positive energy amidst such virulent negativity, like a backdrop of it. And I wonder, like, how do you stay so? It sounds positive and optimistic. So, like, where does that come from, and how do you forge ahead and not get beaten down by it?
Well, thank you for that. I get tired and discouraged like everyone else, but I don't stay there because I can't. I don't know if that's because of the name my parents gave me. I'm just hearing it all the time. My entire life has embedded something in me. I think a little bit probably comes from my faith. I'm a Christian, and so I have to believe in God's plan and a fundamental love and hope, if you will, and to choose that love rather than to choose hate and violence. It's a choice every day. You can choose rage that will kill you, and it won't matter a whit to the person who's being racist or sexist or trying to kill you. It just destroys you. Or you can choose life, and you can choose love, and that's what I make that choice every day to believe that it matters, that life matters, that the work I'm doing matters. And I think that it also helps to I've surrounded myself with a community, often a virtual community of writers and editors and other activists and thinkers, and just people with a social conscious, people who care, people who want to make the world a better place, who won't be defeated, because defeat is to give the people who believe in hate and violence and destruction of us all win. If you don't choose hope, the person who's trying to kill you wins. I choose life, so I choose hope, and I believe that there are enough people who do care enough about the lives of all humanity that we will continue to move in that direction to create a country and world that values all our humanity. And I'll do my part to make that happen.
Hugs and high fives to all of those who made it to the end. Did you dig the show? I hope you did. Consider leaving an honest rating, or for 60 seconds of your time, an honest review. Reviews help embolden and widen the community, help with visibility. We're building it here at CNFHQ, and we want you to join in. Those reviews help with that visibility, like I said. If you leave a review, I'll offer up a free editing sesh for up to 2,000 words. You usually have to pay double for that in Vegas, Cotton. Also, I have a monthly newsletter where I send out my reading, documentary film, and podcast recommendations, as well as what you might have missed from the world of the creative nonfiction podcast, the one you're listening to right now. Lots are joining, so why don't you? Once a month, no spam, can't beat it. Thank you again for listening. Have a CNF and great week, friends. Bye.